Many people around the world are attached to their pets and treat them as a family member. Unfortunately, the lifespan of a pet is very short when compared to human life, and losing your pet can be extremely upsetting. However, there are many people who claim that they have been visited by their beloved pet after they have passed. The following are 3 cases where in the first case their pet had tried to communicate to them that they have passed, and in the second 2 cases their pet has come back to visit them and to tell them that they are still around. Jim Ferguson. In 1970, Jim was residing in Los Angeles and relates an unusual encounter he had whilst driving with his aunt and cousin from Los Angeles to Ontario, a town located 50 miles east of Los Angeles. Jim remembers the car being a green Buick station wagon, which his aunt was driving. The road they were driving on was in the countryside, and at the time of the incident, they were on a long straight downgrade with a wide panoramic view ahead. As they were driving, Jim could see a dog crossing the road coming from the opposite carriageway and had started to cross the road. At this stage, Jim was not concerned, as it was so far into the distance that by the time they would have reached it, the dog would have easily crossed safely. As they grew closer, Jim was now getting concerned because the dog appeared to be taking longer than it should have to get across to the other side of the road. As it reached the central barrier, he screamed to his aunt, "Watch the dog! Watch the dog!" For some inexplicable reason, Jim felt certain they were going to hit the dog, which seemed odd considering that it had started to cross when they were so far away. The dog had plenty of time to see them, and his auntie had plenty of time to see it, but for some weird reason, his aunt had not seen the dog and with a loud thump had hit the poor creature. Surprised, his aunt quickly realised that she'd hit something but had not seen it. Jim then said to his auntie, "You ran over the dog even after I warned you earlier." But his auntie just looked back at him with a confused look saying, "Which dog? I didn't see a dog." As they got out of the car, they could see that the grille was dented, and as they looked back along the road, they saw the body of a dog laying on the roadside. It was obviously dead. Because of the unusual circumstances that the dog had died, for some reason Jim made a mental note of the date and time of the incident being Tuesday the 15th of December at 4:30 p.m. At this stage, Jim was feeling uneasy about everything. A few months later, he returned to England after being picked up at the airport by his family. On the journey home, Jim sensed his family were unusually quiet, that they were holding something back from him. They eventually told him tragic news that his dog had died. However, it seemed that Jim was prepared for this moment and was able to tell them the date and time of his dog's passing. The family just looked at him in shock, saying, "How did you know that?" Jim had intuitively connected his own dog in England with the road incident in the States, and had sensed all along that something was not right. On thinking back to the incident in the States, Jim recalled that at the time of seeing the dog on the road, at the same time he was thinking of his own dog back in England, which was the reason why he had made the mental note of the date and time that it had happened. He'd remember that the time of the incident being 4:30 p.m, and when they worked out the time difference in England, it was the same time that the vet was putting down his own dog. Jim was wondering whether this was all just an amazing coincidence that the dogs would have died at exactly the same time, or had his dog wanted to say goodbye in some way, to tell him that he was dying. Jim now wonders whether the dog in the States was a real dog, though they had seen it laying physically on the road. Or was it temporarily possessed by Jim's dog to advise him of his passing? Michael Cromwell. In 1997, Michael was residing in Israel, and on the 5th of June of that year had to have his beloved cat Yael put to sleep. She was 14 years old. A few months earlier, she had been diagnosed with cancer, where her health deteriorated quickly, and Michael realised it would be cruel to keep her alive. Michael had found Yael in 1983, abandoned on the side of the road, and she was only about 4 or 5 weeks old. He was immediately struck by a beautiful colouring of dark cocoa brown markings with a wide area around her mouth and rust-coloured nose. She looked to be part Abyssinian. From the beginning, she was an extremely verbal cat. He would only have to look at her and she would respond with a meow. When he called her name, she immediately came running wherever she'd been at the time. However, she did have an unusual habit that she would only let you pick her up on her terms. She would also like to get under Michael's feet by continually walking in and around them, causing him to either trip or stumble. Michael had never lost a pet before and cried all the way to the vets and all the way home. He proceeded to cry for many days after that. In order to shake off his misery, he would clean the house and do the laundry, where he saw it as a type of therapy. A short time later, he was walking from the living room to the kitchen when he suddenly felt something between his legs and almost stumbled over. He looked down expecting to see one of his other cats between his legs because it felt so real and solid on his foot. But when he looked down, there was nothing there. He immediately sensed that it was Yao coming back to visit him to tell him she was okay and was still around. The feeling was both eerie and joyful. Then one Sunday night on September the 21st, he was laying down in a half-awake and half-asleep state just before dawn. He looked towards his bedroom door, which he usually kept shut at night, and wondered why it was open. Then all of a sudden, he felt something jump upon his bed and start walking. As he looked down, he could see that it was his beloved Yao coming towards him, where he was then able to cuddle and pet her. He was totally elated and excited about seeing her again, and was even able to bury his nose in her fur. She was very soft and warm, and felt very real. He felt total joy being able to see and touch her again. He was hoping that when the time came for his other pets he owned, he hoped that they too would pay him a visit to tell him, "Hey, I'm still around." Belinda Child. In 1984, Belinda had an unusual encounter with her pet cat. In October that year, a ginger and white cat had passed at the age of 12. She then buried him in the back garden. About a month later in November, she was standing in her garden where it was cold and misty. She suddenly noticed a small shape walk out of the fog and down the path towards her. As it drew closer, she could see that it was a ginger and white cat which had come from the direction of its final resting place, and it walked right up to her feet. After what seemed a few minutes, it then turned around and walked back into the fog towards its grave, and she never saw it again. She was certain that it was not her imagination, and it could not have been a neighbour's cat because she knew all of the cats, and none of them owned a ginger and white cat. She definitely felt that her cat had returned in spirit to say goodbye.